On October the 9th and 10th, senior officials from the Taliban and the United States met for the first time since the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan in August. The two sides discussed containing extremist groups and easing the evacuation of foreign citizens and Afghans from the country. The U.S. delegation reiterated the Taliban will be judged by its actions and not its words, but who will judge the United States? My special guest today is three-time Academy Award winner filmmaker Oliver Stone, known for creating some of America's most iconic movies, including the Vietnam War drama Platoon, JFK, a film about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the biographical thriller Snowden. As well as being a revered filmmaker, Stone is also a veteran of the Vietnam War. So it's a great honor to have Oliver Stone joining us from California in the United States. Good evening, Mr. Stone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Chen.
So you fought in the Vietnam War. Let's go straight into our dialogue. You fought in the Vietnam War at the age of 21. In an interview earlier this year, you said, we went to war on a false basis. Unfortunately, the same forces that made that war happen continued in our life, and they controlled us and pushed us into another war and another war and another war. What are these forces that keep pushing the U.S. into wars? Is this something inherent in the system?
You've asked a key question. It's obviously concerned me my whole life because I grew up after World War II, and I think after that war, the United States changed remarkably. It became overly concerned about communism and made that a bugaboo and created a monster of energy, an enemy that was enormous, a worldwide conspiracy that was engulfing the world, led by Russia and communist China, so they said, and they were spreading communism like dominoes all over the planet, and that they would take over our own government. Now, it all sounds crazy. It may sound crazy to a person who's a modern person who's read a lot, but in those days, believe me, it was frightening. I was a young man, and I was 10 years old, 11 years old. My father was scaring me. He was a soldier in World War II. He was telling me stories about what the Russians were doing in Washington, D.C., spies. They were in our schools with their mentality. Mm-hmm. Communism was a disease, you see. It was like COVID, and it could be caught. And it was, so in other words, the United States, in a sense, was fighting against domestic reform too, because the labor unions were associated with communism. The teachers in the schools were associated with communism. Joe McCarthy, who was a zealot of a senator, associated any kind of internal questioning as communism. And it became very dangerous for liberals, people who had more cosmopolitan outlook, for them to express themselves. I know this from my father's life because he was in business and he had many friends who were of a liberal persuasion, but they were muzzled in this period. They were scared to talk.
So what is it? Is it the fear about communism, or is it people's inherent fear about, finding out about themselves, about their weaknesses, their limitations that drive the United States, or is it capital that are capitalizing on these?
There's all those factors. The concept psychologically that you're scared of what scares you. You're creating what scares you is the enemy, and you attack the enemy, and the enemy has to be defeated like a virus. And I think, in a sense, it's what's scared. It's something that's in us that's scared. Secondly, and very important, is as you say, the capital destruction. After World War II, there was a tremendous fear of unemployment. Again, coming back. We had a major depression in the 1930s in the United States. My father was a victim of it, as were many. And there was a fear that after all the soldiers came home from abroad, the East and the West, there would be an excess of men who could not find employment. And to keep the war machine rolling, we found out in the war, in those 5 years of war, that we made factories that were turning out aircraft and all kinds of munitions.
Mm-hmm.
We found that it created employment. So over a period of a few years, the Republicans, as opposed to the Democrats, really said, let's create the fear of communism. Fear is what's going to keep this program, domestic spending, going. And that's what happened.
What got you out of this fear? Because the influence of a father on a young boy can be immense.
Sure.
But what liberated you?
It took me years. The buildup occurred under Eisenhower. Essentially, the military-industrial complex grew, especially from 1952 to 1960 when he left office. And it never turned back since that time, never turned back. And that's very important to remember. It goes all the way through 2020. So from 1952, 53, during the Korean War, the United States really starts to ramp up into a military garrison. Not only a garrison in the United States, but enormous amount of bases abroad. We never gave up any of the bases from World War II. We stayed in Japan, we stayed in Germany, and of course and France and England, we stayed. We never left. In my lifetime, it's been very difficult because I grew up under the shadow of fear, and I was conservative in the beginning of my life, very much so. And I went to Vietnam under the impression of my father's, of that sense that the Vietnamese were part of this conspiracy of communism to take over the world. Okay. Mm-hmm. I went over there and I fought a frontline unit. I volunteered for the infantry. I came back. I can't say I changed overnight, but I saw a tremendous amount of inconsistency, lack of reason, and cruelty. And it affected me. It affected me, but I didn't do anything. I mean, it took a long time. Many other people were more conscious than I was, but I did go to school. I went back to college, to NYU, New York University. I studied film, and I obviously was under the influence of people who I met, and I started to broaden my experience of the world. And by the time I was 30 years old, I was starting to change. I had many fights with my father and so forth. I talk about it in my my memoir that I wrote recently called Chasing the Light. I'll
be interested, because it is very interesting how many people are still being influenced by that kind of fear about communism, or under the influence of those theories.
It's across the country. Yeah, you run across people in the United States who talk about the Russians like they're dogs or something. There's a lot of that. I mean, people in America, many people don't have passports. It's like I guess a lot of ignorant countries where they assume that the foreigners are dangerous, and this is an old thing that goes back to the fear of immigrants too, but certainly the fear of Russia was instilled, and it's still there. It's still there. Mm. Now, many people have traveled to Russia and know what the real story is and want to have an open system, but it's very difficult once you start to spend the money on the military-industrial complex that we have to cut back.
What about China? How much understanding do people have about China compared to Russia?
About as much as Russia. What I was trying to say when you asked me the question is, even when Joe Biden, who I have to commend him for withdrawing from Afghanistan, even though he withdrew, they raised the defense budget more this year. They went to another number, they call it 700 billion, 750 or something like that, but they raised more money. So in other words, it doesn't stop. There's a system in place. People know there are contracts, huge amount of spending, and that's what they're interested in. So in a sense, it's our greed. It has become our greed, and people are getting very fat off it.
Are you frustrated about it? Because you produced a documentary series called The Untold History of the United States, which was released in 2012, well, almost a decade ago. And it's a long series, right, of all of the wars that the U.S. won. And it gives an insight into the period of American history from the end of the Second World War to the Cold War and to later. How was the series received in America? Do you think American public is learning or is willing to learn the truth of the past, especially about these wars?
Well, every country has problems with their own history, and a lot of people don't know their own history. The series was received well by progressives. That's to say, many historians on the progressive side were quite moved by it. It's a 12-hour series. It was on network cable. It's not to say it was public television. It's not on public television. It was on a network show for which you need a subscription. So it has a limited access. And then later on, we sold it to Warner Brothers, and they did a DVD, and there have been showings now on Netflix, and made it finally to Netflix, at least in the United States. So it has been seen, and by a large group of people, and I can't say it's been censored, but there's no question that in this country where I live, if you have these kind of educational histories, they don't make it to general television. They don't make it to public television.
What are the forces behind it?
Don't buy them. What?
Is it people are not interested, or by human nature they don't want to see these painful episodes of the past? Or
I think the attitude is, frankly, and cut to the chase here, it's like with movies, they don't want too much controversy. So if you're saying something that is going to be arguable and discussed and fought over and raise passions, it's not good for television. What they want is they like excitement, but it has to be a certain kind of excitement, often related to violence and sports, for example, but not the history of the country, where you're questioning it. Now, some things change, like with the recent Black Lives Matter. There has been much more discussion about racism in the United States, much more so, and that's commendable. That's commendable. And they've re-examined the roots of the Civil War, and this is a beginning of a change. And there are all kinds of people, young people coming up, who begin to question. And hopefully, the more you learn, the more you want to know, which is what I feel. And one thing leads to the other, but there's still so much ignorance and a lack of history, especially when it comes to communism, and especially when it comes to the policies of the United States, foreign policies since World War II.
do you think, you talk about history and the difficulty to look back, especially to the past of yourself. What about what has been unfolding in front of people's eyes? And I mean that by the withdrawal in Afghanistan. It was played out on national television, on international television, definitely very dramatic, very messy and tragic in many senses. Do you think people have paid enough attention to this? I mean, in the United States, and the discussion had been deep enough, profound enough that they are at least learning something about what happened, in this past 20 years.
It's hard to tell, Chin. The same thing happened when we pulled out of Vietnam in 1970. 75. It fell in 75. We pulled out in 73, and the Vietnamese army did the same thing with the Afghan army. They folded quickly, and the political structure changed quickly. But there was a lot of finger pointing, recriminations, and I'm sure there will be the same thing in Afghanistan, although it's a smaller war in terms of casualties. But the military tends to overlook these things, and they blame the politicians. They say we could have won Vietnam, but it was badly handled from the beginning. We fought with one hand behind our backs. There's all thousands of excuses, somewhat similar to what the Germans did after World War I, and they lived off their anger and discontent. So there was a tremendous amount of discontent and a split in this country after Vietnam. My film Platoon and Born on the 4th of July, and then the third film I made about the Vietnamese, which was Heaven and Earth, created an enormous amount of controversy and disturbance. I can't say it's resolved, and the same thing is going to happen with Afghanistan. There'll be those people who say we should have fought and we could have won and blah, 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 and there'll be those people who say, what were we doing there in the first place? The foreign intervention with our troops does not work. It has never worked, apparently. It didn't work back in the Mexican War, and it doesn't work. We went to the Philippines in 1898, and they fought us to the teeth. They fought a long, extended guerrilla war, and they were never happy with the United States occupation. Same thing is true in Korea, and you asked about China. You know, that was the first time I think the American people really woke up to China. First of all, in 1949, you know, when China came into existence and as a communist republic, that was the end. I mean, the Americans went crazy over here. They thought that this was completely screwed up by Franklin Roosevelt and then by the Democrats, Harry Truman, and that he's responsible for this, although they could not accept that there was an incompetent Chinese army, nationalist army that couldn't win anything because they were so corrupt, and they ended up in Taiwan. So what happened was after we went to war quickly with the Koreans, which is another debacle. Talk about a debacle that never gets talked about. It's called the Forgotten War. Americans bombed Korea unbelievably cruelly.
There has been actually, speaking of the Korean War, during this past few weeks, there has been much talk about this very hard-fought battle on the Chosin Lake, and a Chinese movie was made about this, and history was dug out about what happened, and American journalists were filming that movie, filming during that battle. Also, their footage also came out. Huge discussion. Have you heard about this? Have you really heard about this? What are your comments? I would really be interested in find out.
Well, I'm fascinated by the Korean War. It's the forgotten war. Because there wasn't that much media back then, and the American forces controlled the media much better than they were able to in Vietnam. So it was a bloody, ridiculous war, and unnecessary because essentially it came out of the fear of communism. We were told that Stalin was behind the Russian Stalin was behind the invasion of South Korea, and we went in there thinking we were fighting communism. And then when Douglas MacArthur moved up north, the general, he was talking repeatedly about bombing China. He was talking about dropping nuclear bomb on China, atomic bomb. And that's when the Chinese started to move in, and they came into the war in a big way. And that battle you're talking about was part of that winter of 1950-51 when the American forces retreated into the south again, and it was a bloody war. The Chinese lost 1 million men at least in that campaign, the Americans were not prepared for this kind of warfare, and it ended up as you know, as a stalemate 2 years, 3 years later, and we didn't learn anything from it. It was just a fight against communism, and in which we did the same thing we did in Vietnam, but even worse. We bombed the South and we bombed the North.
What about,
we bombed, I mean, talking about killing civilians, this was so many civilians were killed. People know about the North because we flattened it, but essentially they don't know about the South. We also flattened a lot of the areas in the South.
Let's fast forward to present day. President Joe Biden, upon withdrawing from Afghanistan, basically he said the United States needs to stop the damage in Afghanistan to concentrate on major power competition, and with that he means China. And there's this hyped talk about democracy or like-minded countries versus authoritarian regimes such as China. So do you think the shadows of that kind of idea that have been haunting the United States and other parts of is still here with us?
You know, for several years, the last 7-8 years, it was Russia. And certainly when the last 2 years of Trump, it was China. China was always in the news, and it was the bad guy. And it's very childish what's going on, but the United States has control over its news, and often its news is propaganda. So we started to hear about the Chinese and how what's the name of the electronics? Hawaii.
Huawei,
The,
you mean the company?
Huawei.
The company. Yeah.
Huawei was a bad guy, and 5G was going to be taken over by the Chinese. This was, again, the same thing as the mind warfare of the 1950s, where communism was going to take over. Now it's 5G. I mean, there was no, I mean, obviously China. Same thing with the labor system in Xinjiang. Help me with these pronunciations.
Xinjiang. You mean yeah.
Yeah, they were making all these accusations about genocide, which was insane, because there was no proof of it. It was propaganda, and they were selling, and the Christians too. I mean, everything that the United States could throw on the fire. You don't hear about it right now. You don't hear about it. Why? Because the United States now has decided, maybe, hopefully, to calm down its Asia pivot, but they promised to send more troops to Asia. They've armed the Australians. They're trying to arm the Vietnamese and so forth, and the Filipinos, but I don't think they'll go for it. There's definitely a move to back to the Pacific. Hillary Clinton talked about it.
Right.
Obama talked about it. It was threatened, but we were always distracted by the Middle East. And now there's talk about it. And the people of the United States are subjected again to propaganda, and who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? We all pray that it doesn't turn into.
You said America must change its point of view from seeking to still be the only power in the world that is in control of the world, and you call it a suicidal path. Do you think it is still very much on that course? And
I pray from
can it veer from that course? We have to take it away from that, or whatever, however you call it. But this must not be the case.
Listen, I've been working on a documentary now for 2 years almost on clean energy. I'm a firm believer in nuclear power. It's one of the main. We need nuclear power as well as renewables to bridge this gap with what's coming. We need more and more electricity around the world. It's not just the United States and the West. It's China, it's India, it's all these countries in Africa. There's going to be such a demand for electricity. This is a time when we really have to think and be aware and conscious for this planet. And I think there's a natural partnership between the United States. I've said this for several years now, a natural partnership between China, the United States, to create clean energy, as well as with Russia, which has done a lot of good work with nuclear. So has China. China has done a lot of good work with nuclear energy, but China, and also with solar panels and wind turbines, but China still uses far too much coal, as we know, and we have to get rid of coal. We have to get rid of gas and oil. Without it, we're going to die anyway, so it doesn't matter if we blow ourselves up. And I think a lot of the younger people know this. They sense it, that nuclear war is not the issue anymore. It's climate change. And China can be our partner.
Sure, and there are some encouraging signs. I mean, John Kerry, who is special envoy, right, initially on climate change cooperation with China, but actually has sent very strong messages about cooperation, whether only in climate change. And there have been some talk of, for instance, recoupling between the United States economy and China by the trade representative, for instance, Catherine Tai. Are these developments encouraging to you? And of course, the talk of an upcoming presidential summit, virtually, albeit.
Yes, we hope so. And as I said before, the talk about Hawaii and Xinjiang has calmed down. Hopefully, it will not come back. But there are a lot of people in the United States, still hardcore people, that are working against any kind of rapprochement with China or Russia. They're at it night and day, and there's all these think tanks, lobbies. It's a strange thing to be living in a country where so much falsification is going on. I live here in this world, and I'm a movie maker. I'd like to see the movie business a little bit more liberal in terms of not creating situations where China or Russia are the bad guy in these movies. It doesn't work for me.
If I were to ask you something about a piece of advice on how to improve international communication of China, what would it be?
What would it be?
Yeah.
Well, I think, first of all, I think trade and economic liberalization is always the key to peace. The more people trade and get to know each other and travel, the better we all are. When we live in our isolation in societies, it becomes dangerous. So I think trade, making money, although it can be, there's an ugly side to this, but that's very important that these countries prosper, but they can prosper using clean energy. This is a very important lesson for us. We don't have to exploit the universe. We don't have to destroy the land and trying to make money. What we have to do is refocus our energies on getting rid of gas and oil. And if we can do that, that would be the biggest thing we can do for the world. The biggest thing we could do for the world. We could really change things. And I think there's so many more jobs could be created.
Yeah.
I applaud China for its advanced nuclear energy work, as well as Russia. The United States is also doing advanced nuclear, but not as broadly as these two countries are.
But, speaking of nuclear power, there has been a campaign against it because of the difficulty to get rid of nuclear waste and the kind of risks you might have concerning nuclear power. So really briefly, briefly, what do you say to that?
Well, who originally paid for all that was the gas companies. Oil and gas companies are invested heavily back in the 1950s. The United States, when they started to develop, we were on our way to developing nuclear power. We would have it now. We would have it all over the world if it had been allowed to develop freely. But there was a concerted campaign with money and propaganda to scare people about waste and radiation, none of which is realistic.
But if you look at Fukushima, what happened there? It was a real accident.
Yes, it was a real accident. So was Chernobyl. At Fukushima, let me remind you, there was a tsunami. That's what killed the people. 0 people died from nuclear there. Nobody died from radiation poisoning. And it was badly built on a site that was not well done with its, for whatever reasons.
But the radiation did go on for a decade, and it's still haunting the health of a lot of people.
Yeah, but it's fear. That's fear. That's fear, and the oil and gas companies use that. They keep putting it up. And also the environmental movement fell for that. But a lot of environmentalists are waking up. Okay. And they when you really get into the research, which is what we tried to do in this movie, is you will understand that there is nothing to fear from nuclear energy. It's way, way safer per capita deaths than any other form of industrialization, any other form.
Okay.
And the only casualties that happened were at Chernobyl. And we know why. And that was back in 1986. Much has changed since then. The technology is so much better.
Okay. All right, time running out. The conversation could go on and on, but thank you so much, Oliver Stone, for sharing with us your insight. Thank you. Hope to talk to you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The award-winning filmmaker Oliver Stone joining us from the United States. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.